Hello and welcome to the Blockchain and Us, where pioneers and thought leaders talk about their journey in blockchain technology, crypto assets, and the token economy. And I'm your host, Manuel Staggers. If you enjoy this podcast, please give it a top rating and review on iTunes, and feel free to follow me on Twitter at Manuel Staggers. This episode has support from no official sponsor, but from my very own The Blockchain and Us newsletter. Get an email from me every 2 weeks with a very short summary of new podcast episodes, so you can immediately pick those interviews you'd like to listen to. To stay up to date, just visit www.theblockchainandus.com and sign up today. My guest today in this somewhat shorter special episode is the one and only Joe Lubin. Joe is the co-founder of Ethereum and the founder of ConsenSys, which is, in its own words, a global formation of technologists and entrepreneurs building the infrastructure, applications, and practices that enable a decentralized world. This conversation took place on very short notice, and I'd like to thank everybody at ConsenSys who made this happen. And now, to the interview. Hi, Joe, and many thanks for taking time today.
Sure, pleasure.
What do you think are maybe things that people most often misunderstand about Ethereum?
So what do people most often misunderstand about Ethereum? I think it's a big, complicated, sophisticated project. Maybe the main misunderstanding is that people either significantly in the space or outside of the space I think try to map it on to the way corporations operate right now. And the Ethereum project is a massively decentralized project. It's essentially an open source project and platform. And decision-making is a big, fuzzy, hairy, messy thing. There is, so I think in terms of leadership, there are lots of leaders on the project. Vitalik is an outstanding driver of the technology, an outstanding research scientist, and an individual of great integrity and great decision-making capability in that he sources opinion broadly, weighs opinion, makes his own decisions. But he doesn't, I've never seen him tell anybody to do anything, and I've never, I haven't seen him often make decisions for the project. Decisions are really made by consensus, and there is a consensus SUS, and there is a process by which proposals get proposed and commented on and essentially voted on by people who implement things. And if there's sufficient popular opinion, they make their way through this arduous process and into the clients. And even if they get into the clients at times, as we saw during the DAO event, the software developers actually gave the people downloading the software a choice of which of the forks they would choose to activate on their particular node. So that would be, I think, the biggest misunderstanding, that there is nobody in control.
Mm-hmm. There's nobody in control, and everything's decentralized, even decision making. So maybe this whole idea of a decentralized world is just hard to understand.
Well, I guess that's true. I mean, we have different degrees of decentralization amongst different systems. So Ethereum is not a top-down command and control infrastructure. And that is, I guess, unusual for some people. But it's increasingly an architecture that makes more and more sense. So we have great communication mechanisms right now around the world, and we have tools that can enable us to come to decisions amongst a group of actors, even if up to half of the actors are malicious. So these blockchain systems can enable that sort of decentralized collective decision making, and we're building tools on top of those protocols. So different tools, different voting systems, liquid democracy for delegating votes, and futarchy. And so we're going to see a lot of experimenting with different mechanisms. We're doing some of that at our company. And the age in which we need to organize things via top-down command and control and hierarchically is dissipating somewhat. Those are still good mechanisms in many contexts, but those mechanisms are most effective when communication is slow and expensive and decision-making is therefore difficult. And we're often in contexts where we don't have those sorts of constraints anymore.
Mm-hmm. And you said it yourself that world is maybe slowly, coming to an end, and maybe something new emerges.
Absolutely. And even within decentralized organizations, there are good uses for hierarchy. So there are good uses for increasingly abstracted representation of information, or fluid hierarchies where you have role systems that form for a specific project, as long as you don't have a rigid structural hierarchy, so that people can lock in power and silo information. As long as these things are able to fluidly construct themselves and dissipate and reconstruct themselves for different purposes, then I think you're fine.
When you imagine that all these visions that you have with the things you're building, with what Ethereum can do, imagine all of this came true. How would you describe, some of the main characteristics of that kind of world?
So on the permissionless network side of things, it would look like a decentralized World Wide Web, where we have full control over our aspects of identity, can monetize those if we wish to, and much greater agency, much greater economic agency, much greater political agency, social agency, where we, for our economic or other lives, can participate in protocol-based open platforms, and we don't need intermediaries to facilitate transactions for us, and we can occupy different roles on protocol-based open platforms in situations that we care about, like maybe in the music industry on Ujo Music, and make a living that way, or just get greater satisfaction from participating through our own greater agency.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Imagine we went, to the year maybe 2025, and we look back. What do you think might we have underestimated, and what might we have overestimated?
2025 is pretty far away. It's definitely hard to figure out all the ways of using this technology, because essentially when a new technology becomes established, the early uses of the technology basically reflect the uses of previous generations of technology. So TV is invented, and people stand up in front of the camera and do radio plays. Basically, they just read their radio play part, and so we're gonna use this new technology, and we'll poke at and explore little dimensions that are obvious to us to make use of. Okay, great, we can tokenize some assets. That's cool. We can vote. We can create true or fair randomness. We can have gaming systems that are provably fair. But those are just cute additions to current paradigms or enhancements of current paradigms. We don't really know what is going to be constructed by creative people 10 or so years from now. So it's a bit of a cop-out answer. But if you look at how the web technology ramified between 1989 when it was invented and 99 when like real normal human beings were using email. I guess you could have extrapolated from there, but you couldn't really, I think, extrapolate to people sending 140 character messages or dating online or getting into a stranger's car or sleeping in a stranger's home, and that these would be sort of very common mechanisms in society in a couple decades.
Well, it's definitely hard to imagine what's possible.
Yeah, so it is, I mean, we have lots of speculations about what's possible. So we're going to tokenize virtually everything. We're going to have deep liquid markets for tokenized everything. We're going to be able to trade many different assets against many other assets. We're going to have fluid buying and selling mechanisms where all we do is think, or we basically decide we want to buy this thing, and our smart agent wallet will figure out which tokens we want to get rid of first and use those to buy things. We're going to have data markets. We're going to have sensors feeding those data markets. We're going to have my utterances, my personal information, signals coming off my body, maybe feeding those data markets. I'm going to be, as we discussed before, in greater control of those things and have greater agency in how those things are used. So I think we move into a world where the silos dissolve significantly, information silos, power silos, transactional silos, into a world where free markets will be pretty pervasive. So free markets for data and virtually everything.
Which is a good thing in many events. But if you look at the other side, I mean, why would such a decentralized world not be a good idea?
I can't think of any reasons why a decentralized world wouldn't be a good idea. I think any technology can be used for nefarious purposes, but that technology, because it is open and accessible, will have bad actors drawn to it, but will also have good actors drawn to it, and I think we'll have the ability to create self-regulatory mechanisms that can police bad behavior. So, for instance, right now, if I want to issue shares in a company and sell those shares to naive grandmothers, I can do that. I set up a bucket shop. I start making phone calls. That's a difficult activity to track down and police. You can do traditional police work. The SEC and law enforcement does take care of those situations. But we have a lot of great stuff going on in token launches around the world. But there's also lots of bad projects and fraudulent projects. And we're at the start of that ecosystem. As we evolve in that ecosystem, it's going to become necessary to release a white paper and to share certain significant pieces of data about your project in order to get anybody to pay attention to it. And so in that context of global access to this information, low barrier to going out and collecting that information, I think we would be able to create much better self-regulatory systems to essentially crowd police that sort of activity. If you're not disclosing all the relevant data, and if you aren't well received by a incentivized set of analyst actors who are sharing their analyses, then you're basically not going to be relevant in the token launch space.
What is a skill that you think is important for people to have to be relevant in the future?
Well, if the thesis is that various technologies will ramify on systems in the future, and blockchain technology is one of those profound technologies, then it's going to be everywhere. So we are going to need people with all sorts of talents, from obviously software development, but anything, legal, marketing, etc. So it's I think it represents a shift in how society will operate. In 1989, we all lived our lives very differently. And we've all essentially adapted. Many of us have taken similar skills, like in the legal profession, and we've had to upskill ourselves and understand how these new systems work. But we're still essentially doing some, core classes of activities, and I think we'll continue to do that. Certainly, as we move towards a world in which software undergirds lots of our activities. It's all about creating appropriate user interfaces so that the human beings can operate on their terms, and the software facilitates what we as humans want to do together.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Imagine there weren't any Ethereum, there were no ConsenSys. What do you think would you be doing?
I would do what I've been doing all my life, read about technology, build technology, and I'd probably sleep more.
Okay, great. Joe, I have a ton of other questions that I'd love to ask, but I know you have to go. I really appreciate your taking time for this interview.
Well, thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us today. More info on our guest and our sponsors is in the show notes of this episode and on the podcast website, theblockchainandus.com. To help people find this podcast, it's important that you download, subscribe, and give it a top rating and review on iTunes or on the podcast platform of your choice. I'm Manuel Staggers, and I thank you very much for listening.